Same time, same place. Tea with Tyson, same hat. Here we are reading The Forgotten 500. The last thing that we had read, the Germans had gone in and killed one of the villages for helping the Americans. This is called Escaping Yugoslavia. This is chapter 6. The airmen spent days. The airmen spent days, weeks, months waiting for help, hoping they wouldn't be found by the Germans, and trying to figure out a way to escape from enemy territory. They concluded that there just weren't many options, and so they became steadily more depressed about their situation. General Mihailovich, who came to Pranjane to meet with the American airmen more than once, was well aware of the men's festering depression and the reality that there appeared to be no effort by the Allies to rescue them. In addition to protecting them during their stay in Yugoslavia, Mihailovich was doing all he could to get the men home. He was sending information to the United States through indirect channels, making sure the United States government knew these men were here, that he was helping them, and that he would assist with a proposed rescue attempt. While Mihailovich truly cared about the airmen and their welfare, he also saw the potential for more aid from the Allies in his effort to fight the Nazis and Communist Josip Broz Tito, his opponent in the simultaneous civil war that threatened to tear the country apart. Mihailovich knew that helping the Allied airmen get home could lead to more support for his men, who were barely surviving on minimal food, rations, old and insufficient arms, and ragged clothes. Many of his men, fierce fighters, had to make do in the cold mountainside with only felt slippers or boots so worn that their bare feet touched the ground more than what was left of the soles of their boots. In the months that he had been harboring the downed airmen, Mihailovich had been diligently sending information about each one by shortwave radio so that the Allies would know they were in safe hands. He even got messages to some of the airmen's families, assuring them that their loved ones were safe for the moment. Part of Mihailovich's concern was the families of the airmen not being informed that they were simply missing in action, because he knew that would only inspire worry. It was reasonable to assume that a loved one reported as missing in action was dead, or at least captured, so Mihailovich thought that he was doing a favor by letting the Allies know that these men were relatively safe in the hills of Yugoslavia. Mihailovich had his men send short-wave radio messages on a regular basis, reporting the name, rank, and military identification number of each airman his men had collected. The messages went first to the Yugoslav government, which was operating in exile in Cairo, Egypt, and from there they were sent on to Konstantin Fotik, the ambassador of Yugoslavia stationed in Washington, D.C. In one message, Mihailovich said, "Please advise the American Air Ministry that there are more than 100 American aviators in our midst. We notified the English Supreme Command for the Mediterranean a long time ago. The English replied that they would send an officer to take care of the evacuation. Meanwhile, to date, this has not been done. It would be better still if the Americans, and not the British, take part in the evacuation." Fotik delivered the information to the War Department with assurances that Mihailovich was protecting the men for the moment, but also requesting that something be done to rescue them. The situation was grave, and there was no telling how long the airmen could last before the Germans found out that they were gathering there. The information was dutifully received and recorded, but little else was done. No rescue was planned. Most of the airmen's relatives were not notified that the airmen were alive and in good hands. They received the standard missing in action telegram like everyone else whose husband or son went down over enemy territory, the same one that Orsini's mother received. With the War Department sitting on the information and making no effort to organize a rescue, the lives of the airmen fell into the hands of a sophisticated, learned, and beautiful blonde woman in Washington, D.C. If only the airmen had known that such a brainy beauty back home knew of their plight and was worried for them. That simple knowledge would have made another day pass more easily. The woman was Mirjana Vujnovic. Mirjana Vujnovic, a lady in the Eastern European tradition, gracious, proper, and conservative, but at the same time warm, generous, and funny. While she was outspoken with family and close friends, she was reserved in public. Slender and with fine features and lively deep blue eyes, her blonde hair worn in the most modest shoulder-length style, Mirjana always caught the attention of young men who soon found there was much more to this gentle woman than her good looks. Mirjana was a great listener, skilled at drawing people out by listening intently, asking the right questions and offering support. Her great passions, after her family, were literature and the arts. Mirjana was married to George Vujnovic, the control agent with the OSS in Bari, Italy. George was a tall, ruggedly handsome man, an all-American son of immigrants who seemed custom-built to look good in a uniform. The OSS was, in essence, home of the spies and secret operatives that got things done behind enemy lines. They did whatever was necessary, using trickery, subterfuge, exotic weapons, and nerves of steel to slip in among the enemy and accomplish things that might be impossible for an entire battalion of soldiers to do. From the post in Bari, in the recently liberated Italy, Vujnovic was responsible for operations in several nearby countries, including Yugoslavia. Mirjana knew what her husband did for the military, even though most OSS officers kept their job descriptions close to the vest. Mirjana was more than just an adoring wife, waiting back home for her husband serving overseas, though she was that too. A native of Yugoslavia herself, she had been through plenty with George and knew some of what he and the other men serving under him were going through in Europe. In May 1944, however, Mirjana was safely ensconced in Washington, D.C., 8.5 months pregnant with their first child. Mirjana had little contact with her husband, other than the occasional letter, and spent her days with friends, including the other Yugoslav nationals who had immigrated to the United States. With a job at the Yugoslavian embassy, Mirjana was able to adjust well to a more comfortable, safe life in the United States, while still maintaining contact with the people and the culture of her homeland. It was through these contacts that she heard about the plight of the downed airmen halfway around the world. The community of Yugoslav immigrants was a tight one, and the news from back home spread through the group quickly. When the embassy received reports from General Mihailovich about the hundreds of downed airmen hidden in the countryside, the news raced through the hallways. As it became clear that the War Department was not responding quickly to the notice, the plight of the American airmen became fodder for gossip every time a few Yugoslav immigrants got together for coffee in the morning or a drink in the evening. I hear Mihailovich is helping some airmen in the hills, a lot of them. Word of the airmen's situation, sketchy as the information was by the time it filtered down from officials to the embassy, spread quickly among anyone with a connection to Yugoslavia. All those boys are waiting for help. Mihailovich is protecting them. But the War Department isn't doing anything. Mirjana's friends knew that her husband was serving with a military group in Italy that was more than just a typical unit, so they wasted no time in getting the news to her. She was intrigued, just like everyone else who heard the story, and wondered why no one was doing anything to help the downed airmen. The next time she wrote George in Bari, she asked about the rumor she had heard, more as idle chit-chat from back home than any sort of urgent request. There is plenty of talk here about the men whose planes were shot down in Yugoslavia, and how Draza Mihailovich is helping them until they can be rescued. I hear that there are perhaps 100 gathered in one place. Are you involved in trying to get them out? Mirjana didn't really expect an answer from George. She knew that he couldn't and wouldn't write back with any information about OSS operations, but she was making conversation with her husband as best she could, and she was genuinely curious nonetheless, so she asked just to get it off her mind. When George Vujnovich received the letter from Mirjana, his first concern was her pregnancy and whether there was anything new to report in that regard. He was pleased to hear that all was fine with his first child and he would soon be a father, although it pained him that he would not be there for the birth of his daughter, to be named Xenia. Among all the other news from home in Mirjana's letter, her offhand comment about the men in Yugoslavia was the one that stayed with him as he put the letter away and went about the rest of his day. He kept thinking about that question. He hadn't even heard about this particular group of downed airmen waiting rescue, and he was in the position to know more about such matters than most people in the military. It was no surprise to him that there were downed airmen in Yugoslavia, of course. It was common knowledge that plenty of flyers had gone down in that region while on Ploesti bomb runs, and that the OSS that some had survived and were evading capture. But 100 airmen all in one place, waiting for rescue? Could Mirjana's information be right? Reports from OSS agents in the field had made it clear that any airman stranded in Yugoslavia was in dire straits. One agent reported finding a half-starved B-24 tail gunner who had been shot down in the first raid on Ploesti. He was discovered rooting around in a farmer's pigsty, fighting the animals for bits of rancid food. Another agent reported that 2 fighter pilots had been hidden in a convent, only to be discovered by Germans when their army-issued boots protruded from underneath the long black habits supplied by the nuns. A habit is the robe, just in case you didn't know. Other agents reported finding injured American airmen hidden and tended by peasants on the hillsides. A year earlier, General Nathan Twining, commander of the 15th Air Force, organized a joint rescue effort for the airmen known to be in Yugoslavia, using the resources of the Air Force and the OSS agents already at work behind enemy lines in the occupied country. The OSS agents delivered escape maps to the downed airmen that would point them toward friendly areas where they could be picked up with the safe houses marked along the route. Agents also provided the Yugoslav villagers, almost all of them illiterate, with posters showing them how to recognize Allied planes and the insignia of the friendly forces, with OSS agents providing covert organization on the ground and Air Force planes making taxi runs. About 100 flyers had been rescued in 1943. The effort was aided by both Mihailovich's Chechnik forces and Tito's partisans in the last year before those two sides erupted in an all-out civil war. Vujnovich knew any such rescue would be even more difficult now, with those two sides fighting against each other as bitterly as either fought the Germans. The OSS and the Air Force had both performed admirably in the 1943 rescues, but if there were 100 flyers waiting for rescue this year, why hadn't he heard about it? If they were being protected by Mihailovich, could they be organized enough to effect a real rescue? Vujnovich was intrigued by this curious question from home, and he had to find out if there was a job here for his OSS team. If there were 100 men in Yugoslavia waiting for us to do something, we've got to get going. I've got to see if Mirjana is right. We'll stop there for now.